It all started on a cold, stormy day in 1980. Benny, Johnny, and Victoria were stuck inside, watching the rain pour down. What was supposed to be a fun holiday had turned into the worst one ever. The weather was miserable, and the village was tense. 3 people had disappeared after going to the small island nearby. No one knew what happened to them, and the villagers were scared. Benny, whose dad was one of the missing people, couldn't take it anymore. One evening, as thunder rumbled in the distance, he stood up and said, "I want to find my dad." Johnny and Victoria looked at him, unsure of what to say. They understood how he felt, but they were just as scared as everyone else. "I'm going to that island," Benny said, his voice firm. "With or without you." After a moment of silence, Johnny and Victoria nodded. They didn't want to let him go alone. The island wasn't just any island. It was surrounded by dark stories. 200 years ago, pirates had discovered it. Only one pirate made it back alive, and he claimed the others were cursed. Some said there was treasure hidden in an ancient temple on the island, but no one dared to look for it. The next day, Benny, Johnny, and Victoria climbed into a small boat and set out. They didn't even know exactly where the island was, only that it was somewhere out there. Hours passed as they searched, but they found nothing. Johnny was getting hungry, Victoria was shivering, and Benny's focus never wavered. Just as the sun disappeared behind the horizon, Benny shouted, "Look! Over there!" Through the mist, they saw it, the island, dark and covered in twisted trees. They reached the shore and pulled their boat onto the sand. Up close, the island was terrifying. Black, bare trees reached out like claws, and the cold wind carried the cries of distant crows. Nervously, they built a small fire and huddled together, too uneasy to talk. Eventually, they fell asleep. Through the island felt alive around them. Benny woke in the middle of the night. The fire had gone out, and everything was dark and cold. He heard a faint voice, almost like a whisper, calling his name. Looking around, he saw Johnny and Victoria still asleep. Something about a voice pulled him, and without thinking, he walked into the jungle. The jungle seemed to guide him, the trees shifting as if creating a path. Soon, Benny found an ancient temple in the heart of the island. The walls were covered in strange carvings, and the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. From inside, he heard a low chanting that sent chills down his spine. Even though he was terrified, he couldn't stop himself. He stepped inside. When Johnny woke up, he noticed Benny was gone. "Benny?" he called. But there was no answer. Victoria woke too, and they saw footprints leading into the jungle. Grabbing a flashlight, they followed the trail. The jungle was dark, and the trees seemed to close in around them. Finally, they reached the temple and saw Benny standing in front of this entrance, staring blankly. "Benny!" Johnny called, but Benny didn't respond. The chanting grew louder. Victoria grabbed Johnny's arm, whispering, "We should leave." But before they could, Benny stepped into the temple. Inside, it was freezing. The walls were covered in carvings of faces that seemed to shift and move. At the center of the room was a golden mask on a stone pedestal. "Benny, don't touch it," Johnny yelled, but Benny ignored him and grabbed the mask. The temple shook violently, and a deep voice boomed, "You have awakened the curse. No one leaves." Benny turned around, his face pale, his eyes dark. "The island has me now," he said coldly, "and it will have you too." The ground began to crack, and darkness seeped through the floor. Johnny grabbed Victoria's hand, yelling, "We have to go." They ran out of the temple as it crumbled behind them, but Benny's voice echoed through the jungle, "You can't escape, you are cursed." As they fled, the jungle felt alive, its trees scrubbing at them, its whispers growing louder. They reached the beach but their boat was gone, and the fog grew thicker, swallowing the shoreline. Benny's voice came again, empty and haunting. "You are already mine." Suddenly, the ground split open, and dark shadows rose, wrapping around their legs. They struggled, but the shadows pulled them down. The last thing they saw was Benny's twisted face in the darkness, staring at them. And then, silence. Benny, Johnny, and Victoria were all lost to the island. The curse had claimed them.